It was just 4 years ago that we all lived in a much simpler world. 4 years ago, you would not so much as bat an eye when a large crowd gathered in Edmond for prayer, or a wave of incoming freshmen cheered on the players at McCauley Stadium. 4 years ago, the scariest thing done in school would be taking AP exams, filling out college applications, and finding a date to prom. But that was 4 years ago, and today it is a very different world. With a sharp rise in COVID cases throughout the country, especially among college students, we are now tasked with protecting ourselves and one another from an invisible threat. While the virus cannot be seen by the naked eye, we will use our sense of vision and perception to fight and win the battle against our unseen enemy.
Today I'm going to be telling you about the biology of the eye. Light enters the eyes through the cornea and the lens. And similar to a camera lens, the lens focuses the light into an image onto the retina. And now, when it hits the retina, there are going to be photoreceptors, which are specialized neural cells which pick up the visual input. The two types of photoreceptors are rods and cones. Now, rods are colorblind, so they're unable to detect between the different colors, but on the plus side, they're able to see in dim light. However, you also have cones, which are able to see color. Now, there are 3 different types of cones that correspond to the different wavelengths of light, and these 3 cone types allow you to distinguish between all the different types of visual colors on the spectrum. Now, at the center of your retina is the fovea, and that is where there's a large concentration of only cones, and this section of your vision has the greatest acuity. So right now, wherever you're staring at, that's kind of where the fovea is centered at, and that's where you'll be able to have the most clear focus of the image. One very important aspect of our visual processing system is lateral inhibition. And lateral inhibition is a way of enhancing edges. So to be able to distinguish between different objects and between like the skyline from the road, lateral inhibition helps out with that. So what is lateral inhibition? Well, it's the process of cells inhibiting the firing rate of nearby cells when they are stimulated. And an example I'll give will show you how lateral inhibition helps detect edges. So say you have a big crowd, and now we couldn't do this now because of COVID, but let's say we have a lot of people all concentrated and we shine a spotlight on some of them. And we tell everyone, hey, if light shines on you, raise your hands. And if someone next to you is raising their hand, then hold their hand instead of raising it up. So what will happen is everyone in the center will be holding hands with each other, and then everyone on the way outside will have their hands down. However, for the people on the edges, they'll be holding the hand of someone next to them that light shined on them, and one hand will be in the air. So if you look around and see all the people with their hands in the air, those are the people on the edges of the image. So by that process, you could see, okay, this is the outline of the people that have the light shined on them. So that's just one way that our visual system processes the images in order to help us make more sense of it and be able to act accordingly based on that information.
The next stop through the human visual system is that of the Gestalt psychologists and their theories. Now, there's a lot to learn in the wide world of psychology, so we tried a few different ways in order to make it easier to learn. Our attempts at making a lesson through dance and also subliminal messaging didn't work, so we finally decided that the best way to teach this would be telling a story. One day in the future, Wheaton College decided to reverse its policy on pets in dorm rooms. So naturally, the first thing you did was head on down to PetSmart and pick up a pet. Now as you're walking in, the lead cashier smiles at you and says, "Hello, today we have a special for all Wheaton College students. we have a very special pet in the back. His name is Gestalt, and we've had him for a while. He's a very good and loyal pet. The thing is, we've had him for too long, and he really needs a loving home. So, let me show him to you. Now she leads you to the back and shows you Gestalt, and it looks like a very interesting pet. Now you might be wondering what kind of animal Gestalt is. So, in a few seconds I'm going to show it to you, and I want you to think up the very first thing that comes to your mind. Ready? Here he is. Now a lot of you might have said, well, of course, that's got to be a rabbit. That's the only thing it could be. Some of the others in the room might have said, well, I see a duck. And the answer, of course, is that it could be both a rabbit or a duck, depending on how you look at it. This is, in essence, the very basic of Gestalt psychology, that an image could be on the screen, it's both a rabbit and a duck, but ultimately it is you and your brain that decide what it is going to be interpreted as. Now, this image is specially designed to be two things, but the same principles apply in nature. There's a lot of different things that need to be interpreted rather quickly by your brain. In fact, it can be summed up in 5 major principles, and here they are: similarity, proximity, good continuation, closure, and simplicity. One of these principles that you might have recognized as you walked into the store was that of similarity. On your right, you'll notice a bargain bin of discount animal foods that didn't tend to sell so well. They're kind of strewn about in no discernible pattern, but your brain will recognize that they are both red and blue and will group them as such. Along with similarity, the other 4 principles work within our brain very quickly to help us recognize patterns and other noticeable features in our everyday lives.
Another key aspect of our visual processing system is receptive fields. Now, these are specialized neurons that respond differently to visual triggers based on their type. So some of the different types of receptive fields are center surround, orientation specific, and movement detectors. So center surround are visual neurons which act as edge detectors. So if light hits the entire area that they're focused on, they won't fire. And really they'll only fire if light hits only the edge but not the center. So they'll really strongly fire when they're at the very edge of where the light's hitting. Another type of receptive field is the orientation specific. So these look for line segments that are facing a certain orientation and will fire if they see one. So there could be a vertical orientation specific neuron which will fire if in that area it sees a vertical line segment of some type. It could be diagonal, horizontal, any type. There are also movement detectors similarly, which will look for motion in a particular direction. So it might fire if it sees something moving from left to right or up to down or any possible information. And all of these receptive fields work together to help us make sense of what we're seeing. Now, the way the brain makes sense of all of this visual information and firings from neurons all over the brain and in different lobes is through the process of parallel processing. So this is when there are many different types of analysis of visual input that are being conducted simultaneously in different parts of the brain. And the information from each of these areas influences the other areas. For example, in the optic nerve, there are P and M cells that deal with the form and layout of what it's seeing, as well as the movement, generally speaking. And these are working hand in hand to make sense of both the motion and the form of what you're seeing. There's also the what and where systems at different parts of your brain, which, like the names imply, they're trying to tell your brain what are you seeing and where in your visual field it is. So when they work together, you could see, oh, there's a bike in that specific area. and it lets you make sense and then be able to process everything you are seeing. Finally, one very important part of our visual processing system that I'd like to talk about is neural synchrony. And this is the way that the brain processes different visual inputs as being related to the same object. What it is that the neurons fire in synchrony when they're focused on the same object. So say, for example, there's a red bike that's riding past you. And when that's happening, your movement receptive fields are going to be firing if it's like a horizontal left to right one. The neurons that are relating to color might be firing because it's red. And it also might have edge detection neurons that are firing around the layout and outline of the bike, as well as vertical and horizontal orientation specific. So we have all of these different parts of the brain that are firing. But in order to your brain to be able to put it together and say, okay, all of these are corresponding to a bike moving, neural synchrony means that the firing rates of their neurons would be happening in a rhythm, all working together. And when your brain does this, it then groups them into one object, the bike, and then you can make sense of what you're seeing. So neural synchrony is a way to bind all the different information from different parts of your brain coming at the same time and into one conceptual thing or an object that it can focus on. One interesting application of visual perception is the uncanny valley effect. Now, this is the effect where, as an object or being, whether a robot or an animation in a movie, as it becomes closer to human likeness, we'll have emotional connection to it up to a certain point. But then the uncanny valley hits, and then it severely drops to where we have less affinity towards it than something completely inhuman like an industrial robot. Now, this is when the being or object gets close enough to reality where it's similar but not quite, so we can tell something's off. So something like a lifelike robot or a corpse or a zombie, we can see elements of humanity in it, but it's not real enough, so it makes us uncomfortable. And finally, once it gets realistic enough, we get past the uncanny valley effect and start to have an emotional connection to it. So before the uncanny valley, we still can have emotional connections to the characters. So in these examples of Spirited Away and Up, we can tell that they're supposed to be humans, but none of us would confuse it for the real deal. So we're able to see them as represented as humans, but when they don't behave exactly like humans, we don't find that uncomfortable. So we're able to have a real emotional attachment to them. However, things start getting bad when you get into the uncanny valley. So with the example of the movie Cats or this robot, we see elements of humanity in them, so it's almost there, but the little things that are off just make us really uncomfortable, and it just looks bad and not something that we feel connected to. And one thing to mention is, due to technological advancements, we're actually able to get past the uncanny valley. So if it gets realistic enough, then we can again start having emotional attachments to it, even if it's not completely realistic. So in video games and CGI, like the examples on the screen, you can tell that it's not a picture, but it's still real enough that you do have an emotional attachment to them and can connect with them. So finally, we're going to use everything that we've learned about visual processing to design an advertisement to spread the promotion of COVID-safe behaviors among campus on Wheaton. So what we're going to do is we're going to design a video, and in this video we're going to associate unsafe behavior with an uncomfortable feeling by employing the uncanny valley effect. So we're going to show a video of people not wearing masks and not social distancing, but we're going to edit it using video softwares to make them look slightly unnatural and have them move in a weird way, and hopefully that will bring them into the uncanny valley, which will associate those behaviors with an unnatural and uncomfortable gut feeling in hopes of promoting safe COVID behaviors. And the reason we're using a video is from our knowledge about attention and peripheral vision. So it's shown that when objects are moving, they attract our attention from the peripheral better. And you can see that where if you're staring at something and something flies by to the side of you, you're more likely to look at it than if it was just there all along. And furthermore, we're going to use a cycle of static images and motion on the screen to get an onset of motion that draws attention effectively. And a study showed that if you have objects that just start to move, then that suddenness will draw your attention even better than something that's just continually moving. And we're going to design the video around the principles of getting the proper type and amount of complexity in it. So there are two different types of visual complexity, feature complexity and design complexity. Now, feature complexity is the compression ratio of an image. So when you use a JPEG algorithm, it will take a big file size and make it smaller by using an algorithm that groups together similar patterns of pixels. So if you have a lot of white space in the image or just a wall that's all the same color, it can group those pixels together and see it as one object rather than hundreds of separate pixels. So it's related to the amount of visual clutter, because if you just had random pixels of every color all around, it couldn't find the pattern, so it wouldn't be able to properly compress it. And now design complexity is related to the structuring and arrangement of the image. And this is related to the Gestalt principles, because if there's an easy way for your brain to group together the design with the Gestalt principles, such as common fate or proximity, then it means there'll be less design complexity. And what the researchers found is that advertisements with low feature complexity but high design complexity were the most effective. So thus, we're going to design the video to have low feature complexity by having the actors just stand in front of a blank wall and remove all unnecessary background clutter, but give it high design complexity by making the people dress different and move around differently, so it's harder for the Gestalt principles that our processing systems use to group them together as one object. So by doing this, we will increase the effectiveness of the advertisement in being able to spread our message of promoting COVID safe behaviors to the best of our abilities.
When I was originally applying to Wheaton, it did relatively well on all the areas, a lot of A's in food, dorm life, classes, professors, and those things, but it had a D+ on the party scene. Now, that was about 4 years ago, and I'm sure through various out-of-this-world Bible study parties and things like that, we've gotten the party scene up to a C-, which is good for the college. It means that there's not a great amount of large gatherings or things like that. So that's really turned out in our favor, especially in times when a lot of colleges around the country are closing due to large gatherings of that nature. But we want to keep it that way. So a quick summary of the things we've been talking about is that we want to provide a sense of unease when people are not abiding by COVID guidelines. This could be large gatherings or not wearing a mask, and we want to promote a sense of safety when they are following the guidelines. So basic psychological principles of association and things of that nature. We want to associate ease and peace with people wearing the masks. That's why we've created senses of safety by seeing images of people wearing a mask, and the images here, we see that the faces are they're not right. They have that uncanny valley when they're not wearing the mask. So these images provided also with the videos shown around campus. We're not allowed to put up physical posters because they changed that, but we could use like the TV at Sam's or other places around campus, provide emails, things like that. We use those forms of media and communication in order to get our message across. And that should be about all. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Thank you, guys.